Okay, hi. I think we're going to get started. Uh, uh, so I'd like to welcome all of you to 3GNY, to our event today, our author series featuring the book Living Among the Dead by author Adena Astrowsky, who is, of course, a 3G herself. She is an author, an attorney, a proud mom, and a Renaissance woman, and we are so excited to have her here today to discuss this very unique book. My name is Cayle White. I am a 3GNY board member. And in case you're not familiar with 3GNY, 3GNY is an educational nonprofit organization for grandchildren of survivors and our supporters. We were founded in 2005 with an original group of 6, and 3GNY's membership now exceeds 2,600. We are most proud of our flagship educational program, We Do, which is short for We Educate. This initiative empowers grandchildren of survivors to learn and compellingly share their families' Holocaust experiences in school classrooms and with community groups. We Do was developed under the guidance of Facing History and Ourselves, and it prepares participants to learn and teach their family stories. We Do is a powerful contribution to Holocaust education. As the population of survivors declines, their story should not be lost with them. Now is the time to take responsibilities for these stories. For We Do, we have a collaborative partnership with the American Society for Yad Vashem's Young Leadership Associates Group, and we are thankful for their support. Since We Do started in 2010, we've trained 250 speakers, visited 221 classrooms in 84 different schools, and we have reached more than 25,000 students. And we're still going. Since COVID-19 hit, we've moved our We Do training sessions for 3Gs onto a virtual platform. We're now visiting classrooms via Zoom when school is in session, and we are working with teachers to ensure that we can still make an impact even if we cannot meet in person right now. We have so much more to do, and we're making it happen however we can. But in order for us to keep this critical work going, your support is essential. 3GNY is volunteer run, and we rely on donations. So if you would like to make a donation, no matter how big or small, it will help all of our 3G programming and help us to sustain We Do and to train even more 3Gs to speak in classrooms throughout the New York City area. So it is my pleasure to introduce Adena Astrowsky. Adena Astrowsky is the grandchild of 2 Holocaust survivors. Her grandmother spoke to her often about her experiences during the Holocaust, which had a profound impact on her life. She continues to honor her grandmother's life by speaking about her grandmother's survival and lessons learned from the Holocaust. Adena has dedicated her career to helping the most vulnerable in our society. She did this by prosecuting child sexual abuse cases and domestic violence cases within the Maricopa County Attorney's Office. Currently, she handles foreign extradition cases. Adena taught Sunday school at her temple for 8 years, and in her last 2 years, she co-taught a Holocaust studies class. Adena contributes articles to Mask, Mother's Awareness on School-Age Kids magazine, often writing about topics such as children's safety, drugs, and law. Adena has also chaired events to raise money for the Phoenix Children's Hospital. Adena was recognized for her professional and philanthropic work with an Amazing Woman Award from the Phoenix Suns and the National Bank of Arizona. Adena's greatest role, however, is as the mother of 3 very active teenagers. Now we will get to the book specifically. So this book has been a very popular book on Amazon. It actually won the Amazon Reader's Favorite Gold Medal of 2020 winner in the category biography. This is the story of one remarkable young woman's unimaginable journey through the rise of the Nazi regime in World War II and the aftermath. It's the story of her grandmother, Mania Lichtenstein. It's a dramatic story of survival, and it's narrated by Adena, and her memories are interwoven with beautiful passages of poetry and personal reflection. As we know, many Jews were not killed only in concentration camps. They were murdered in mass murders by the killing units, the Einsatzgruppen, in particular in Nazi-occupied Russian territory, and then they were buried in pits, often alive. As a young girl, Manya witnessed the horrors while doing everything within her power to try to survive. She lived in Włodzimierz, which is north of Lvov, in the Ukraine, where she was interned for 3 years in a labor camp nearby and managed to escape and hid in the forest until the end of the war. Although she was the sole survivor of her family, Manya went on to rebuild a new life in the United States with a new language and new customs, always carrying with her the losses of her family and her memories. 75 years after liberation, we are still witnessing acts of cruelty born out of hatred and discrimination. Living among the dead reminds us of the beautiful communities that existed before World War II, the lives lost, and those that lived on, and the importance to never forget these stories so that history does not repeat itself. So once again, I'm happy to introduce Adena. Adena, nice to have you here.
Thank you so much, Cayle. And thank you all for attending this
So
session.
I have to say, I think you're our
Uh-oh.
Thank you. Okay, sorry, I cut you off. So I just wanted to say that Adena is our first speaker that we've ever had from Arizona. We're branching out into different parts of the country to try to unite 3Gs across America and across the world, actually. So we're thrilled to have you here.
Thank you very much, Cayle. Is it okay to begin? I don't.
Yes, absolutely. So
Okay,
go ahead.
super.
I know you have a presentation about the book, so I'll let you go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much. I want to thank 3GNY for branching out and having me and Arizonans speak today. Before we all started talking about the book, I showed Cayle and Jesse my backyard, which has my pool and the palm trees and the beautiful weather outside, which we'll have a little bit longer. I know it's getting cold back east, but thank you all for being here today with me as we discuss my grandmother. And her story. So thank you, Cayle, and thank you 3GNY and all of you that are attending. This is the cover of my book, Living Among the Dead, my grandmother's Holocaust survival story of love and strength. And as Cayle mentioned, it did just very recently win the Reader's Favorite 2020 Book Award gold medal. And so obviously, this many years post-liberation, we need to keep these stories alive. It's really up to us, the 2Gs, the 3Gs, and now even the 4Gs, to tell the stories of the Holocaust survivors in order to keep their memories alive, because obviously we don't ever want such a thing to happen again. As Cayle mentioned, I am the mother of 3 teenagers. They're all in high school right now, so life has become a little crazy. I've been a prosecutor with the Maricopa County Attorney's Office since 1998. I did leave twice for short terms, one when my children were born. And I currently handle foreign extradition cases for my office, which is a whole very unique set of skills and very interesting area for me. Last year, the Phoenix Holocaust Association asked if I would be interested in being a member of the board, and that's just been proven to be very, very interesting for me personally. I've really enjoyed my work there. And Living Among the Dead, sort of for the reasons that Cayle mentioned, it's done very well. It's been a bestseller on Amazon in several different categories, as I've listed there, and I've been very grateful to all the readers and those that have reached out to me, either leaving reviews on Amazon or personally reaching out to me and telling me how the book has touched them. So I thank them for that. And so my story of telling my grandmother's story, that's a photo of me sitting on my grandmother's lap when I was little. That was up in Canada. I am the oldest granddaughter, and I was named after her 2 sisters. So even though my English name is Adena, I have 2 Hebrew names, Rivka and Nechamka. And my grandmother was the youngest of 3 girls, which we'll talk about in a minute. Her sisters were Rivka and Nechamka. And I noticed that growing up, there was always this presence of absence on my grandmother's side versus my father's side, where we had so many cousins that, in fact, one of my cousins on my father's side calls me number 9. That's his nickname for me because I'm the 9th cousin in line. He's number 5, so I call him number 5 back. But on my grandmother's side, there really were no cousins for so many years. And it was always, I'd ask my grandmother, to tell me her story. She wasn't quiet about it, but it's difficult to ask survivors what happened for many different reasons. I mean, one, if you've ever worked with victims of crimes, which I have professionally, they relive the trauma as they go back through telling the story. And so I didn't want to make my grandmother have any more pain. And also it was difficult to answer a question. I thought maybe it was a good question. I mean, I was trained to ask questions. That's what I do in court. But even with, what I thought was a good question, there was no easy answer always. And so not being my grandmother's fault at all, it was just sometimes hard to find out what happened. But I knew that it was important to preserve her stories. And one day I was at an author event with my teenage son who writes science fiction, and I had previously self-published the book that you see on the screen, Mother of Souls. And I met someone at this author event, and she said to me, "Your book is so good." She had read it, and she said, "You really should look into getting it published." And so I thought, well, gosh, I don't know if I want to do that, but I decided I would explore it. And so I ended up reaching out to Amsterdam publishers who did end up publishing my book. But it really began with me wanting to gather my grandmother's writings. As Cayle mentioned, my grandmother wrote beautiful passages of poetry and prose and really just some personal reflections. Most in English, her sixth language, some in Yiddish, and one in Polish. And I just thought, I really want to make sure they're all in one place so I can make copies for my children. But then I thought, well, the poems and the poetry don't really make a whole lot of sense if they're not put in their historical context. And so then I went back to her interviews that she did with the Steven Spielberg Shoah Foundation project. And then, of course, my grandmother was living at the time, so I interviewed her and had her fill in gaps. And Amsterdam publishers did tell me that if I worked on rewriting the book and resubmit it, they would look at publishing it. And so that is what I ended up spending quite a bit of time in 2019 doing. And then they did publish the book. Also through that process, I came in touch with a wonderful woman named Marcia Ruth, who I've never met personally. She lives in Sacramento. I know she would kill me if I called her an expert, but to me, she really is an expert on many things related to the Holocaust. And she helped me greatly with putting the historical context within the book. And so anyways, this is a month before my grandmother passed away on February 4th, and it was right after Mother of Souls, after we self-published it. And I named the first book Mother of Souls because when I looked at my grandmother's name, Mania, that's what it said the name meant in the dictionary. And so getting started here, in 1995, my grandmother said this: "As a survivor of the Holocaust, I am very often asked this question: how did you survive? Indeed, how? I, the youngest of the family, shy and insecure, far from being brave. I could answer it with one word: fate. I was meant to survive 3 pogroms, which eliminated the town's about 26,000 Jews." And so by way of a little bit of background, my grandmother was born in December of 1922. Her birth date we'll end up discussing some more later in the discussion because she ends up assuming a different birth date. But that's a picture of her parents. Gershon is her father and Gitel is her mother. He was a pharmacist and she was a stay-at-home mom. And as I mentioned, my grandmother was the youngest of 3 girls. And that was another photo that I found. I love how formal people dressed in order to take photos. Unlike today, right, with our smartphones, we take 20 pictures of the same scene just to have the 20 different images. And my grandmother felt very special about having sisters. And she said, she told me, having sisters makes you important and makes you belong somewhere. And I think that's also really spoken as the youngest of the children. And so obviously pre-war, this picture was taken. That's my grandmother's mother on the very left, Gitel, and my grandmother's the little baby in her lap. Rivka's the oldest daughter in the front with the hat on, and Nechamka's in the back with the white bow in her hair, and her father Gershon sitting on the right side. And so in her hometown, she's really from a very medium-sized city, and it was very cultural for its time. There were 2 gymnasiums there, which are equivalent to our high schools here in the US, and 7 elementary schools. And she lived in the same neighborhood with other Jews. There were 26,000 that lived in her city. And really, she said Jews just settled wherever they were permitted to, since their homeland of Israel had not been born yet. And in the house, they spoke Yiddish, and outside of the home, they spoke Polish. So growing up, even my grandmother spoke 2 languages, and you'll see how she'll add on 4 more as a refugee. This is a photograph that was taken in, I believe, 2000, and this is her hometown of Wlodzimierz, which was in Poland. It's now part of the Ukraine. Through the process of writing my book, Yad Vashem actually put me in touch with one of my grandmother's childhood friends, and the woman lives in Israel, and she only speaks Hebrew and Yiddish, I believe is the second language. And I don't speak either. I can read Hebrew, but I can't speak it fluently. But as it turned out, and I mean, it's just such a small world, a college friend of mine was living in Israel at the time, and she spoke Hebrew. And so very graciously, she went to this woman's house and asked her my questions. And this woman shared a lot of, quite a few photographs, including the next one, which is a picture of the school. And this was where my grandmother went to school as a child. And back then, schools were separated into 4 quadrants. You had the boys' Christian school and the boys' Jewish school, the girls' Christian school, and the girls' Jewish school. The playground of the Jewish girls' school and the boys' Christian school shared a fence. And so oftentimes when they were outside on the playground, she recalled Christian boys spitting at the Jewish girls or throwing soda cans at them. However, they did not tell anyone in charge, my grandmother told me, because culturally, anti-Semitism was accepted and permitted. And later, through a lot of the historical, and through a lot of the research on the historical context, we learned that those boys were part of the Hitler Youth, based on the way my grandmother described them with the lapel pins and so forth. Her childhood, she really spent her days playing with other children. They'd go to each other's homes, they'd walk in the street, they'd sit and talk. You know, they didn't have phones that they could play on during the day. And they did a lot of reading back then, which is always a great thing. And my grandmother described a whole series of books that they would read that reminded me a lot of the golden books that we all had as children. And during the winter, they skated outdoors. My grandmother said that they made a makeshift sled out of a piece of cardboard, and they'd slide down the hill. But they had one luxury item that other neighbors on their street did not have, and that was a radio. And my grandmother said that every Wednesday evening, the Bulgarian transmission played beautiful songs on the hit parade. And my grandmother would learn the songs that night, and then the next day she would teach all the kids at school the songs that she had learned. And they would sing in Polish, Russian, and Yiddish. And my grandmother knew all the popular songs from listening to them on the radio, which made her kind of popular. So the garden was something that was always very special to my grandmother. And she told me that they grew a lot of different vegetables in the garden. They also had cherry and apple trees. And they had this unique flower known to the native land that's called gwoździki in Polish. It carried a very perfumed scent. It was very colorful and bright, and it reminded me a lot of what we know as carnations here. And so I'd like to just read you a brief poem that my grandmother wrote in March 1st of 2000 called Our Magic Garden. And she wrote, "There once was a magic garden, through my childish eyes most ideal, where the early spring's warm sun on my face I still can feel. Never a very sound sleeper, I was up with the tweeting of the birds. The rhapsodic loud sound had told me that they too were glad to be there. I still can smell the aroma that exuded from the rainbow of colors. I watched it like a mother and baby, from the first spurts to full-grown flowers. That magic spot was our garden, that Eden I'll never forget, and never, never shall I see it again, except through the eyes of my mind." And so Hitler's initial rise to power, as we all know, was in 1933. My grandmother said it really did not affect them. Plus, no one, she said, believed that the Nazi regime would be as bad as they ended up becoming. But in 1938, through listening to the radio, they could start hearing a lot of talk of Juden. And around that same time, there was a film that was played at her oldest sister's school, Rivka school, that involved a Jewish girl getting a gift from a Christian boy, and it was, a box, and then she'd unwrap it, and inside that box was a smaller box, and she'd unwrap that, and it'd be a smaller box, and so forth. You get the idea. And then inside the very smallest box was an onion, and apparently it was in today's day we may not think of it as so bad, but back then it was a big sign of anti-Semitism. And of course, they started to see an increase just even within their neighborhood. The Germans invaded her hometown in September of 1939. My grandmother was 17 years old at the time. She remembered a whole group of motorcycles entering into the area, and soon after, a bomb was released, and that bomb killed my grandmother's best friend, her father, the best friend's father, and the best friend's younger sibling. But after 3 days, a deal was made between the Nazis and Stalin. And so now my grandmother lived under Russian control, where she learned Russian in addition to, of course, speaking Yiddish and Polish. And so from 1939 to 1941, she was under Russian occupation. She attended a Russian school, but she told me that things weren't so bad for her attending a Russian school because the Russians loved music and they loved to dance, and so did my grandmother. So in a way, things were a little bit better in that one respect. There was no more private enterprise, however, and so her father, who was a pharmacist and owned a pharmacy, had his pharmacy taken away, and he was then sent to a neighboring city to work in a pharmacy there. And they also were aware of Jews that were sent away to Siberia. Also during this time, my grandmother's oldest sister, Rivka, got married. Her husband was forced to enlist and he was never seen again. In June of 1941, my grandmother's city was captured and enclosed by barbed wire. Posts were then set up for all Jews to register. They were given white armbands with the Star of David on them. The Nazis, and also during that same time, the two ghettos were created, the living ghetto and the dead ghetto. My grandmother told me that the Nazis never referred to the ghettos in this way because they didn't want to instill any fear or panic, but the Jews knew who lived where. And also at this time, all valuables had to be released. Anyone who disobeyed was shot right there on the spot. My grandmother said that during that time they had to give up their candlesticks, and my grandmother wrote, "To give up one's candlestick, an inheritance which remained in families for generations and were without fail lit every Friday night, was a distinct sign of destruction of the Jewish home." My grandmother said that hunger soon became a major problem because the existing food supply became exhausted and additional food was not being provided. Trading was soon taking place between the Poles. They would look to exchange a potato or a piece of bread for anything of value. And my grandmother's family had saved a lot of perfumed powder, which was very popular at the time and something her father had in the pharmacy. And so they brought that home and they would use that to trade it for food. My grandmother said that the living ghetto was larger than the dead ghetto, and no one was permitted to leave except for to perform forced labor. Each day, she said, hundreds of men were taken out of the ghettos to dig mass graves, and they would later learn that one of those graves was to hold 19,000 people, and the second grave was to hold thousands more. And those white armbands that I mentioned a minute ago, those were soon replaced with the 5-inch bright orange and yellow patches that covered both their front and back so that they could easily be seen on the street by anybody looking in their direction. My grandmother said that life in the ghetto was just miserable. They sat around all day, she and her sisters crying. They were very musical, so they would try to sing songs to help pass the time, but they were constantly hungry. They were constantly cold because there was no heat. They lived in a constant state of fear, and they would, sit there and dream of being free. They knew how to knit, and so they would often unravel their sweaters and then reknit them again. And my grandmother talked to me about her oldest sister Rivka's sweater. It had this beautiful intrinsic design on it that she just always really loved, and you'll see that the sweater will come back into play in a minute. Only those that were living in only those that were allowed to live in the living ghetto, they had to have skills or some type of trade in order to be permitted to live there, and they needed a card to prove it. Now, as I mentioned, my grandmother's father was a pharmacist, and that was not considered a skill or trade worthy to the Nazis. But I believe through Rivka's connections, they were able to get him a card listing him as a bricklayer. And so even though he had never laid a brick in his life, he was now, he now had a skill that was important to the Nazis. And so they were permitted to remain in their home and which was very fortunate because their home was already situated within the living ghetto. Now, approximately 26,000 Jews, including those that were brought in from the surrounding towns, had to be crammed into both the living ghetto and the dead ghetto. And so families were brought into my grandmother's house, and there was basically a family in every room. My grandmother said, like you hear from many other stories of Jews in the ghettos, they tried to keep up with the Jewish holidays as best as they could, but it was very difficult. In August of 1942, it was harvest time, and 500 women were taken to work in the wheat field, including my grandmother. They were basically making flour from the wheat and working very long hours. My grandmother said they were supervised by a man who, was on top of a horse, and he would basically, gallop up and down. And if you weren't working fast enough, he would whip you. And my grandmother told me she was whipped once, and she felt very demeaned by it. The first 2 days that they worked in the wheat field, they were given 1 cup of soup and 1 small drink of water for the entire day. But there was nothing on the 3rd day. And my grandmother said that they assumed that they did this because they were about to murder them. So the Nazis figured, why waste food on those that were soon to be dead? But when she got home that night, having worked all day and was so hungry, she told me that her grandmother, whose name was Henya, gave her a little sour pickle that someone had given her. And Henya gave that pickle to my grandmother. And it's funny how such a little pickle could have such meaning, but my grandmother told me that to her, it was a true sign of love and heroism. On September 1st of 1942, 3 trucks came and brought the women from the wheat field back to the dead ghetto. And as you might recall, my grandmother was living in the living ghetto. So she cried with them and pleaded, please let me go back to my family in the living ghetto. But the Ukrainians who were working and helping the Nazis didn't care, and they just laughed at her. And so when she got to the dead ghetto, she quickly found Rivka's in-laws who were situated in the dead ghetto. And she found a cousin of Rivka's, whose name was Popa. Popa at the time was 14, and as you might recall, my grandmother was 17. That night, my grandmother said they stayed up all night fully clothed because they knew something was about to happen. And at 6 a.m. at dawn, they were surrounded by the Nazis and the Ukrainians with automatic rifles. The Germans had entered the dead ghetto. My grandmother ran to a hiding place with Rivka's in-laws. On the 3rd floor of this building, a prominent family lived there, and there was a back wall that contained an armoire which slid open, and through the back of the armoire was a secret entrance up to an attic which was behind it. And so my grandmother went running up there with Popa and some of the other family members of Rivka's in-laws. My grandmother said that they could hear Popa's mother and her 2 little siblings down below being carried away, screaming and crying. But up in the attic, my grandmother hid with some others for 15 days. It had a tin roof on the building, and so it became extremely hot, but they stayed there motionless and not talking. They could hear the Germans tearing apart every Jewish home looking for Jews to meet their quota, and stomping on the roofs, seeing if there was a Jew there. For 15 days, they really had no food and no water. The prominent family who lived on that 3rd floor did bring them a sack of peas, a raw potato, and a few pieces of bread for them to share. And there was a young teenage boy named Plot, who recalled that it had rained, at some point in that week. And there was a dish outside on the balcony gathering rainwater. And so, very courageously, he went outside and got the bowl of water and brought it back so everybody could take a drink. My grandmother's sister, Rivka's father-in-law, when it became his turn to take a sip of water, he decided to pass and allow the children to share his sip of water because he felt that they had a better chance of surviving. My grandmother said that they could see through the blinds that after 15 days, the living ghetto was an inferno. She said people were crying and reciting the Shema. She said the dead ghetto was completely exterminated, and they used some Jews from the living ghetto to murder in order to meet their quota. My grandmother talked to me a lot about this idea of this quota, and she told me that the Germans were very precise and very organized. And once their quota was met, they did not kill one additional person. And the killing that's done here, as Cayle mentioned at the very beginning, these were by mobile killing units called the Einsatzgruppen. This is not part of a concentration camp. These were mobile units that would come into different areas and kill people there in their hometowns. And after 15 days of hiding in the attic, the pogrom ended. My grandmother said it was fate when asked how she survived and not being allowed to return to her home from the field. She said that they emerged with severe weakness and dehydration, and they immediately started to look for anyone that they knew. And the Nazis began organizing the remaining 7,000 Jews, and they acted like nothing happened. My grandmother's sister's father-in-law immediately succumbed to dehydration and died as soon as he emerged. My grandmother said there were no elderly and there were no babies around. And a red school was soon created for Jews to sort through the clothing of those that were murdered. And this is where she saw Rivka's sweater, that beautiful one with the intricate design, and her grandmother Henya's jacket. And she knew they had all been murdered, which they were during this first pogrom. And my grandmother told me that she didn't cry when she saw Rivka's sweater and her grandmother's jacket because she felt that they were the lucky ones. They were now at peace in heaven. A second ghetto was soon created immediately, again, just like the first ghetto, with the living and the dead based on a profession. Here she lived in the dead ghetto, this time with 5 other girls. And every day she worked for the Germans. And on one day in particular, she cut her eyebrow on a window frame, which she ended up having a scar on her eyebrow for the rest of her life, but it caused a significant bleed. And because of the blood, the Germans permitted her to leave. And so she was able to leave work early that day. Now, even though she lived in the dead ghetto this time, she knew a couple that lived in the living ghetto. And the woman asked my grandmother to come over because she knew my grandmother was hungry and she knew my grandmother was not at work that day. And so my grandmother went to the living ghetto to see this couple, and she went to stay there for the night. And exactly 2 months after the first pogrom, the second one began. And that very next morning, the dead ghetto was extinguished within a few hours. And this is at this time, all of Rivka's in-laws perished, with the exception of Popa, the cousin, who was 14. And now my grandmother said that there were 1,000 Jews remaining, including my grandmother. My grandmother said that had she not spent the night with friends, she would have been captured and killed like her roommates. Again, she says it was fate. A new ghetto was created for the remaining 1,000 Jews. And again, only those with a trade were kept alive: tailors, shoemakers, candle makers, those types of trades. And you had to have a piece of paper. That paper meant you had your life. And those without a pass stayed in hiding. My grandmother did not have a pass, and so she stayed in hiding. However, a candle maker who knew my grandmother's father, Gershon, knew of a woman, Mrs. Hirschhorn, who had the piece of paper that I know is very difficult to see on the screen because it's a copy of a copy of a copy. This woman, Mrs. Hirschhorn, had this piece of paper and she left the ghetto without it, and she was shot dead. But this candle maker knew Leon Hirschhorn, the widow, and he asked him, "Can my grandmother have your wife's piece of paper?" And so if you can see, and probably not because it's very difficult, it lists the year of birth as 1906, but my grandmother was born in 1922, so that's a very big age difference. And so very carefully, they changed the 0 to a 1, and that was the piece of paper that my grandmother used. And so even though my grandmother was born in December, This piece of paper shows it was March, and my grandmother insisted on using this birthday for the rest of her life. And just as a quick aside, I will just tell you that it was just, it almost became humorous to my children, who are, of course, fourth generations. We'd go visit her and we'd bring her sunflowers to remind her of the beautiful flowers that grew in the wild, back in her hometown every December to celebrate her birthday. And they'd come running, down the hallway, Bubbie, Bee Bubbie, they call her Bee Bubbie for that was their nickname. Happy birthday. And she'd shush them, it's not, nobody knows it's my birthday. Everyone believes it's in March. She always living with that idea that there could be a Nazi around the corner, which I know many other Holocaust survivors lived with as well. And then equally as funny, though, is we would go visit her in March, like in the assisted living facility where she lived the last year or two of her life. And they would have a piece of paper in the elevator listing all the March birthdays. And there would be my grandmother's name listed, even though it was not her birthday. But anyways, back to my grandmother's story. So life in the ghetto, now, as I mentioned, this is the new ghetto. She worked in this working center with this piece of paper, and she worked with 15 other women. They were forced to work for the German soldiers and the girlfriends of the German soldiers, knitting, which my grandmother was able to do. She said life was very uneventful. She visited her home one last time, risking her life, but she's told me that everything was gone but a heap of bricks, a few pots, and one of her father's socks, and her sister's slippers were mounted on the fence. She saw 3 cherry trees that her father tended. The trunks were still painted white. She said they stood and blossomed as if to announce that life will go on and on. She told me nature continues, perpetuating its task. The third pogrom and final pogrom that my grandmother experienced occurred in December of 1943, exactly 1 year, 1 month, and 1 day after the second pogrom. And this time the Germans were to eliminate the final 1,000 surviving Jews. In December of 1943, my grandmother was getting ready for work when she said chaos ensued. The Germans and Ukrainians stormed into the ghetto, shooting everywhere. And my grandmother said people were running like scared mice, but there was no place to hide. Everybody was out in the open, and they knew who you were. She said she ran with some others outside they were outside. She ran to a little outdoor deserted shed. And inside they were pressed in there like sardines. It kind of reminds me of, like, we have a store here called Home Depot. I don't know if it's across the country, but you can buy outdoor sheds where you can put like your lawnmower, your rake, or your shovel in them. They're vertical, they're not real wide. Some of them, they're more tall and vertical. That's how I always envisioned this shed, where they were pressed like sardines. She said there was no ventilation, and they stood just shoulder to shoulder, unable to move their arms or their bodies. She estimated 20 people packed inside, including Rivka's cousin, Popa. And she said they stood inside all day and night praying for their lives. And she said that obviously there was no food or water or any kind of movement, but she said it started to rain in the middle of the night, and she heard that it was, very quiet. They didn't hear the dogs barking anymore. She felt like the Nazis had left, and it became physically unbearable to just stand there anymore. And with the rain and so forth, they decided that they would run out. Every 2 minutes, they would run, every 10 minutes, they would run out 2 by 2. And so my grandmother ran out with Popa. Now, prior to the ghettos, Popa's parents knew a woman named Janina Zawadzka. She was a Polish woman who they gave some valuables to in exchange for a hiding place should the need ever arise. And my grandmother said this woman was just absolutely lovely and had a lot of pity for the Jews. And so at 3 a.m., my grandmother and Popa ran to her house and knocked on her door. And just real quick, this is a picture of Janina. She and my grandmother exchanged quite a bit of correspondence over the years, and I took some photos of some of the correspondence, and I did submit her name to Yad Vashem's Righteous Among the Nations months ago. I was told I would probably hear something back this November or December. But anyways, that's a picture of her. And so she took them in, and Popa and my grandmother hid under the covers of a little bed inside the house. But soon the neighbors became very suspicious because nobody locked their doors back then. And Janina started to lock the door, and the neighbors were asking her questions why she was doing this. It's very different today where we lock our doors, we lock our windows, we set the alarm. Back then, nobody did this, and it was considered suspicious activity. And so in January, although it was bitter cold outside, Janina moved them to the outdoor stables. They were living where the horses were. My grandmother said there was an awful stench, but they were alive and they had a place to hide. But after 2 months of living in the stables, they decided to leave for the woods by wagon. Janina gave them a very good bottle of vodka to bribe one of the German guards that they had to pass, and they were able to. And so they stayed out in the forest really until they were liberated. They found a family that was in need of someone to help with some clothing for their young boy. So my grandmother and Popa did some knitting in exchange for food. They also met a Russian military representative who told them where the Russians were stationed. They also learned that the Germans were not prepared for the severe Russian winter, and they were starting to suffer from disillusionment. It was breaking the German army spirit, and defeat was becoming obvious. Also in the woods, my grandmother and Popa met up with a group of young Jewish boys, Joseph and Moishe Lichtenstein. And they were from the same hometown, but they didn't know each other well. They just knew of each other. But the four of them became a new family. This is how things were back then. And they remained in the woods, the four of them together. If one got an apple, the four of them shared the apple, my grandmother said, and they stayed there together until they were liberated by following the directions of the Russian dispatchers. This is a picture of Joseph and Moishe Lichtenstein taken in 1946. And they were obviously, upon liberation, elated to be free, but they were immediately met with anti-Semitism and bitterness. She said that the Russians mistrusted everybody and would not allow them to register or settle, so they were constantly on the move. And this is a picture of my grandmother and Popa. My grandmother's on the left and Popa's on the right. They decided to go back to their hometown. They wanted to see if anybody else was alive. And really, they had nowhere else to go. And they didn't know if they would find any relatives, and they didn't. But my grandmother did go back to her home, and she found a lot of the photographs that I've been able to show you today on the floor. They were covered with powder. She just imagines that Nazis came in and dumped powder everywhere that they had in the house. But while they were in their hometown, my grandmother married one of those Lichtenstein boys, Joseph, the one that was on the left, and they got married on October 15th of 1944. They then traveled to Berlin. They had learned that boats were being rejected in Palestine, so although they had considered that, they quickly didn't. And they also moved to a displaced persons camp called Kibbutz Baderach, but they really went from DP camp to DP camp looking for anyone that might still be alive. My mother was born at one of those DP camps in Berlin on July 22nd of 1946. And a year or two after my grandmother passed away, my mother inherited all of her photo albums. And I was just going through them, just wanted to see if I missed any. And I came upon this photograph, which I absolutely love. If you look on the far right side, you see the old cars back then. And I love this just sort of feeling of freedom. My grandmother walking with my mother, who was about 3 years old. It gives the appearance of them not having a care in the world. But I fell in love with this picture so much that I spoke to my publisher, and she agreed, and it became the cover of my book. So anyways, from there, they ended up moving to Hamburg, and then they moved to Montreal. The choices were few. They knew some people moving to Australia, so that was an option. Israel, Palestine back then was not an option anymore, and they knew some people in Montreal. So they moved there on August 5th of 1951. It was a 2-week voyage among the boat that you see there in the photographs. My grandmother said staying in Europe was not an option. And that's a picture of them on the boat. And so after learning German, my grandmother, they ended up in Montreal. She learned French, which was her 5th language. In Montreal, my grandmother gave birth to another daughter, my aunt, And when my mother was 3 and my aunt was 3, Joseph Lichtenstein passed away from leukemia. My mother then met my father in Montreal. His parents had moved there before the war, and they had me and my 2 sisters. My aunt had moved to California for graduate school, and she got married and stayed out west. And so really there was not much for my grandmother in Montreal. My parents had moved to Baltimore, Maryland for just 1 year for my dad's internship. And that's me, born in 1971 with my grandmother. I remember hearing the stories of my grandmother just being astonished that the family was growing in size, really because she was the sole survivor. And now her children were having children. It was really quite a moment for her. But my parents moved to Arizona in 1978. And so in the early 1980s, we moved my grandmother here to Scottsdale to be near us. And really, from all those grandkids, my grandmother ended up with 9 great grandchildren before she passed away. And I always like to say that her story is truly one of fate and miracles. And I should say that when she moved to Arizona, she'd already learned some English, but that ended up being English, her 6th language. So the other Lichtenstein brother, Moishe, that's him in the picture with my grandmother walking down the aisle at my wedding. And what's so funny is he's really a great uncle to me, but I always thought of him as more of a grandfather or uncle. It didn't even occur to me that he was even one step further removed because of how close he was to us. And that's a picture of my grandmother and me at my wedding in 2002. I love to include the pictures with my children. I believe this was actually taken 6 years ago today. That was the assisted living facility that she lived at, where they listed her birthday as being in March in the elevators. And then that was taken just a little bit later in time as my children are growing quickly, and they were quickly taller than her. And so I'd like to just say that my book, Living Among the Dead, really reminds us of the beautiful communities. And I know Cayle mentioned this during the intro, but I like to just remember that it does remind us of the beautiful communities that existed before World War II, the lives lost and those that lived on, and the importance to never forget these stories so that history does not repeat itself. My grandmother she said, "In my misfortune, I was very lucky," which I love that quote. And that's a picture we took with my children when my first book, the self-published one, first came out, and we came over to see her. So what I'd like to just say is thank you so much for being with me today. Sharing my grandmother's story always makes me feel closer to her, and I love that feeling, and I love sharing her story to keep these memories alive. I'd love to answer any questions, and I'd also just like to say that if anyone is interested in a signed copy of my book, I think they're $15. I'd have to double check with Amazon, but I think they're $15. I'd be happy to sign a book and send it to you. I know Jesse will put my email address in the chat. I'm going to stop sharing so we can get back to a regular screen. And then you're welcome to reach out to me, and I'd love to do that. And I'd love to answer any questions that you may have at this time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adena. That was such a moving presentation, and I'm sure your grandmother would be very proud of you if she saw that. And anyways, thank you is not enough. I actually have a couple of questions. So I wanted to know, where did you get such extensively detailed information? Is this all from your grandmother?
So a lot of, yes, my grandmother had an excellent memory. She really, really did. And she remembered a lot of the details, which helped. When I was in law school in the mid to late 90s back east, that's when I learned of the Shoah Foundation project, and I reached out and coordinated having a group come and interview her. So thankfully we have some of that also documented by videotape. But a lot of it was that and questioning her. And then, like I said, so much research was done working with the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and Yad Vashem. And I did also mention Marcia Ruth, who was just fantastic at helping me consider other articles, read articles, watch videos. She just knows so much. And so that helped to fill in a lot of the gaps as well.
So we actually have a question from someone in the chat. What happened to Popa?
I love that question. It's a great question, and I get asked that a lot. And I have to say that, we always, hopefully we all don't have a lot of regrets in life. If I had to say one of my biggest regrets, it would be that I didn't start this book sooner in time, because I don't know a lot about Popa, and my grandmother isn't alive anymore to ask her. From what I know is that after the war, she went to New York, not Montreal, and I believe she got married there and had two daughters. And I believe she's passed away, but before she passed, she had, like many others back east, moved to Florida and was either like, a snowbird in the winter or was living there full time. But I believe she lived a nice full life and had two daughters after the war.
Interesting. So can I ask, what was your grandmother's formal level of education? Like how far did she get in school?
Well, she was going to school until she was about 17. So by today's standards, it wouldn't even be a high school graduate, right?
Right.
She would have gone through some of high school equivalency classes. Um, but I think because she read so much, she was just
Mhm.
very, very bright. She was very bright and she read a lot. So she was very intellectual. And her favorite game to play was Scrabble. She loved playing Scrabble, and she'd beat us all the time, even though English was her sixth language and it's our main language. She'd beat us all the time. She was just excellent with words.
Right, because I wanted to point out what makes this book really remarkable is your grandmother had such an incredible literary talent. She wrote poetry in different languages. She was incredibly expressive, and what's interesting is this book is a bestseller in the high school category, and I think some high school teachers mentioned to you that they like to use it because it has crossover appeal. So they use it to teach literature, but they also use it for their social studies programs to teach history. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Yes, it's been just one of those, came out of nowhere. I didn't expect it to happen. It wasn't on, my mind really when I wrote the book. But yes, because the book includes all of my grandmother's writings, and even the ones that were in other languages, we scanned them and we included them as she wrote them, and then we had them translated. The book has become, and it's also a very good size for school-aged kids. It's not, 400, 500 pages. We're finding that a lot of the school districts are picking it up to use in their curriculum. It's being used by both, we call it ELA, English Language Arts here,
Mhm.
but English, or language arts, and also social studies. And also, I hired someone who was the executive director of a human rights group, and she also worked for the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum as one of their directors. She's an educator, she's a teacher, and she wrote lesson plans for the book. So, and those are free for any teacher that wants to use the book. I am more than happy to send you the PDF with all of the lesson plans. But I think that is also why it's become so popular. I think, like we talked about a little bit yesterday, Cayle, I think it just touches people because it's not a very formal book. It has my voice, as
Mhm.
you can tell from spending the last hour with me. I'm a very informal person. And it's really just about connecting with history and making it of some type of personal nature so that you experience a little bit of what it was like to either have lived then or to be in my grandmother's shoes or so forth. So I think that's why it's done very well, and I'm very humbled by it and very appreciative.
And would you say your grandmother was by nature a very optimistic person? Did she tend to emphasize the positive?
Yes, she always really did. I think she would sometimes go back and, she has another writing that she wrote after attending my bridal shower, and it was really about her wedding, which was nothing like mine. Um, but yes, she, I think, really wanted to live in the moment. And even though she obviously had these horrible memories that lived with her to her last day, she really wanted us to have good lives. When I had, I'm the oldest granddaughter, and I just happen to have the first couple, my older two children are twins. Um, when she had great grandchildren, and these were her first two, it was like mind blowing for her. And one of them was a boy, and we only had girls on my mother's side of the family, so that was like even more shocking to her. But yes, it was really about, you know, being involved with them. She loved my children. Just anytime they'd come see her, she loved that. And yeah, just trying to live in the moment and be positive, and just remember the good things that we have, because things were so not good back then.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. We could stay all day and talk about this, but I really highly recommend this book to anyone. It's really appropriate for and people of all ages, and especially for the up and coming generations. I think it's really an interesting book for them. So once again, I would like to thank Adena Astrowsky. And of course, if anybody has any additional questions for Adena, they can email her directly, or they can send their questions to 3GNY, and we can pass along our questions to her. But we are so grateful that she appeared today on this event,
Thank you.
and we wish her all the best, and we hope that she will become a 3G speaker. I know she already speaks in the schools, but become part of our 3G network. So thank you very much, Adena. And I'd just like to let you, while I still have a captive audience here, I'd like to let you know about some upcoming events that we have. So we have some great virtual events coming up, including our We Do Wednesday programs, where 3Gs who have gone through our educational programming, We Do, will share their fascinating stories live. This upcoming Wednesday, October 28th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, Elizabeth Kamens will share the story of her grandfather escaping Germany after Kristallnacht, being reported as a spy, and ultimately joining the U.S. Army, where he was part of the troops on the beaches of Normandy on D-Day. This is not one to miss. And then on Wednesday, November 11th at 8 p.m., Yoni Litvok will share the quest for a hidden Torah. He will talk about his trip to Poland to find a Torah his grandfather hid when the Nazis invaded Poland, and we can't wait to hear his story as well. So once again, thank you, Adena. Thank you, everyone, for joining, and be well until the next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.